So now we're going to look at solving problems by completing the square, the whole process. Now, what we did to begin with here in the last video is we kind of led you up to it. In other words, we looked at just taking the square root of both sides, and then we looked at factoring and then taking the square root of both sides, and then we kind of touched on this taking half of b and then squaring it. So when you're trying to complete the square, you want to get the number in front of your squared term to be 1. So you might actually have to divide everything by that number that's in front of your squared term to get it to be 1. Then you want to try to get the variables on one side by itself. So you might have to add or subtract the constant to get it to the other side. And then we're going to go through this process that we talked about before. So the first thing we want to do is to get the number in front of our squared term to be 1. So that means for this problem, I got to get rid of timesing by 3. So I'm going to divide everything on both sides by 3. Well, if I divide by 3, I just get an x squared. 2 over 3 is just 2/3. And then 1 over 3 is 1/3. And then 0 over 3 is 0. Now, I want to try to get the variables by themselves. To get the variables by themselves, I got to get rid of that negative 1/3. So I'm going to just add 1/3 to both sides. Now we're at this next step. That's where in the last video we talked about taking half of b and then squaring it. And that's what we have to add to both sides. So if I take half of b, I need to take negative 2/3, half of b, so 1/2 times negative 2/3. Now, in this case, I didn't include the negative because I end up having to square it. If I had a negative here and I squared it, it still ends up being positive. You could include the negative, won't really make a difference here. A fraction times a fraction, remember you multiply the tops, multiply the bottoms, you get 2 over 6, or you get 1/3. Some of you might think, well, half of 2/3, well, I'll divide it into 2 parts, that's just 1/3. So I need to take 1/3 and square it, just following that pattern from the last video. If I add it here, I also need to add it over here, because I got to do the same thing to both sides of the equal sign. So on the right-hand side, I'm going to have 1/3 plus 1/9. Do a common denominator, and I get 4/9. Left-hand side is going to factor into 2 identical parentheses. It's going to factor into an x minus a 1/3 all squared. Now, let's go back here. What's being squared in the beginning? X. So I put an x in the beginning of each parenthesis. What's being squared here at the end? It was a 7, so I put a 7 in the end of each parenthesis. Each parenthesis is the same, so I could write it as 1 parenthesis all squared. So this comes from what's being squared in the beginning. This comes from what's being squared in the end. That even worked over here on this problem. What was being squared in the beginning? X. So I put x in the beginning of each parenthesis. What was being squared here at the end to give me 4? 2. So I put a 2 in the end of each parenthesis. So we're just following that pattern, and mathematics is all about looking at patterns. So I end up getting something squared on the left side equaling a number. Well, then I can easily just go ahead and solve that by taking my square root. So I take the square root of the left side, square root of the right side. Remember that that's plus or minus, because you take the square root of the top over the square root of the bottom there. So then you get x by itself. Since these are both nice normal numbers, I can break it apart and go a 1/3 plus 2/3 and a 1/3 minus a 2/3. So 1/3 plus 2/3 is 1. 1/3 minus 2/3 is negative 2/3. So these are my two answers. So go ahead and try on this one, completing the square, and then watch the video. Divide everything by 2 to get the number in front of your squared term to be positive. Get the variables by themselves by subtracting a 15/2 from both sides. Take half of 11 over 2. So take 11 over 2 times 1 over 2, multiply the tops, multiply the bottoms, gives you 11/4. 11/4 squared is what you have to add to both sides. So if we add it here, we add it over here. Remember when we said we were factoring, you look at what's being squared here in the beginning, which was an x. what was being squared at the end, which was 11 over 4, so that goes in the end of our parenthesis. Over here, we can work this out. This is a 121 over a 16. Do a common denominator, and we end up getting 1/16. So we have something squared equals 1/16, so we can take the square root of both sides. Get x by itself. Remember your plus or minus here. Break it apart into two nice, neat problems. Simplify them down, and you get your two answers. This is solving by completing the square. And solving by completing the square will always work. Factoring sometimes works. Solving by graphing gives you a nice visual picture, but you sometimes only can estimate your answers.